Good morning everyone, and welcome to the NIHR Public Health Research webinar, which is being run jointly by the Public Health Research team and by the NIHR Research Design Service. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Peter Lovell. I lead the Research Design Service here in London, and over the next 40 to 50 minutes we're going to run through a series of short presentations on the programme and the support that's available from the Research Design Service. We will then dedicate the rest of the session to a Q&A. Some questions have already been submitted in advance, and thanks for those. Please, if you're logging in online, send in more questions, and also from the audience. We're now going to move on to the programme for the day. As I said, we have a series of short presentations. I'd now like to ask Gemma, who's Senior Research Manager for the Public Health Research Programme, to give us an introduction to the programme.
Thank you. Right, thank you. Right, so my name is, I need the thing, there we are, that'll help. Here we are. So my name's Gemma. I'm Senior Research Manager for Public Health Research Programme. I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the Public Health Research Programme, and much of what I say will be covered in the following presentations more thoroughly. So the Public Health Research Programme is one of a number of research funding programmes funded by the NIHR. And the NIHR funds applied research. So specifically the Public Health Research Programme. The remit of the Public Health Research Programme is to evaluate the effectiveness of non-NHS public health interventions. So the unique selling point of PHR is that it evaluates non-NHS public health interventions. As it says on screen, the scope is multidisciplinary and broad, covers a wide range of public health interventions. So just a few key principles of the programme. It's a national programme, so it's open to the whole of the UK. Portfolio-wise, we have funded over 100 projects now. I think it's around 120. Average length of projects, 37 months. Average cost, about 700,000. Again, evaluation of non-NHS public health interventions. We support a wide range of methodologies, qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, natural experiments, RCTs, evidence synthesis, systematic reviews, so we're quite all-encompassing. Primary outcome measure. To be in scope for the Public Health Research Programme, your primary outcome measure of your project must be health-related. We will accept proxies. We're unable to fund intervention costs, and I know we'll discuss that more later on as the presentations go on and the Q&As go on. We can't fund development of new interventions, but we can fund the optimisation of existing interventions. So again, we can discuss that more in the Q&A. There are no caps on the amount that we can fund per project, so it can be as costly as you like, as long as you can justify that it is value for money from our perspective. So you need to convince us that it is value for money. So work streams. There are two main work streams. There's a researcher-led work stream, which is open to anyone to apply essentially throughout the year. And then we have the commissioned work stream, which is where we ask for proposals under specific areas of topic ID that we've identified that have evidence gaps. I should also note that we participate in the themed calls, the NIHR themed calls, and currently there is actually a highlight notice for complex health and care needs in older people that is, you can find it if you go to the website and look under the researcher-led funding opportunities. So, lastly from me, all of the proposals that we receive go through this assessment process, regardless if they're from the researcher-led work stream or the commissioned work stream. So there's an internal in-house screening assessment for remit and competitiveness. That involves either the director of the programme or the chair of the research funding board. Then those that get through that stage go to the programme advisory board. The programme advisory board is made up of local authority representatives, directors of public health, charity representatives, NICE, Public Health England, and those individuals look at the importance of public health of the proposals that have come to them. Then, if successful, the applications are seen by the Research Funding Board, and they will scrutinise it for scientific quality, feasibility and value for money. So I'm going to pass over to Andrew Cook, Dr. Andrew Cook, who's our consultant advisor, and he will just go through a few project examples for the programme.
Thank you. See, we can only afford the one microphone, it seems. And Gemma's just gone off with a clicker. Thank you. Right. So my name's Andrew Cook. I'm a public health physician by training, and I work for NetCC some of the week, providing input to the public health research programme. A lot of the questions we get are, is this in remit? Do you care about this question? And unlike, say, the health technology assessment, the scope of what we might be interested in might be a bit difficult to understand and appreciate. So possibly the best examples are to look at the portfolio we've got already. You can see in those 100 to 120 projects we've already funded the vast scope of things that we're actually interested in. But if you can conceive of a health impact and there's a health outcome, we're probably interested in evaluating how that can be changed. But very briefly, to give you some flavours of the areas we've worked in. So we're interested in supporting local decision making. So here, these are topics very much to inform local authorities. You can see it's urban regeneration. You know, where should we put our new motorway? What are the likely effects of that going to be? How do you get the community engaging and self-generating health? What do you do about alcohol? And you see down here this project at the bottom, 093702, which has now finished and reported, and you can find the full report in all its sort of 200-page glory on the NIHR Journals Library website, about what should we expect to happen to health in a population if you change the availability of alcohol. So this was about pubs and off licenses and where are they, and so this project has told us a bit about that, and that will help people who are approving alcohol licenses and things like that in local authorities, we hope. We're very interested in the environment. So transport, how do transport decisions affect health? I mean, that's going to be both through the adoption of active travel. Can you get people cycling more, walking more, driving the car less? So pollution reduction. Certainly in London we have large amounts of air pollution coming out from car exhaust. If we can affect that, we're going to reduce pollution in the capital. So the generation of healthy behaviour in transport. And then once you've done your transport and you go home, are you going home to a house which is well heated, well ventilated? What's the most efficient way of maintaining housing quality and housing stock? And when you're walking home, are you going to get mugged because someone's turned off the street lights? The answer is no. And we have a project that tells us that. So we commissioned that as a vital issue a few years ago. Can you get people using buses? And if you do, what happens? And unsurprisingly, if you give people free bus passes, this project tells us, they use the buses more. But rather importantly, they drive less. And their other active transport goes up a bit. Again, you can read that in full in all its wonderful glory on the Journals Library. And the third one, education. Probably about a quarter of the projects that we're currently funding take place in schools in some way. So what training can you provide to teachers to maintain and promote health? This sort of well-being thing again in this slightly smaller community at the school. How do you get these children into good habits regarding diet and physical activity while they're young enough to make it comparatively easy to affect those activities? And can you stop them smoking or getting into alcohol or other abuse? And then a big problem in this country, teenage pregnancy. We funded a feasibility study a few years ago. can you get boys and girls in school to actively adopt an intention to avoid pregnancy? And we showed that such a study was feasible, and they've come back to be funded. So hopefully we'll get a final answer to that at some point in the future. But there's a feasibility study in this area that we funded. These are a couple of the ones we're very keen on. The reduced street lighting I touched on earlier. You can turn off street lights at various times and it doesn't affect traffic accidents or crime. And then football fans in training. How do you get middle-aged men off the couch and running around? Because they just don't. And it turns out if you can engage them in an organisation that they want to engage with, so a Premier League football club, they'll get up and they'll run around and they'll lose weight and they'll get fitter. Right. Opportunities at the moment, these are all on our website. They change from time to time. These are in our commission mode, and if any of those grab your attention, there's a more detailed 1 or 2 page document on the website, or you can ask us about it later. So that's it from me. Thank you very much. So I'm going to let Frank Kee, who is chair of our funding board, tell you how to get the money.
Okay, by way of introduction, as did Andrew, my name's Frank Kee and I'm a public health physician by training, and my post is funded jointly with the University in Queen's in Belfast, but also the Public Health Agency. And I mention that only to say that there are other people like me on the board who have feet in the real world. So we come at our judgments not only as scientists, but with a very pragmatic perspective on the problems we're trying to address. So the first point here that I'm making is that we are looking for competitive, top quality science, but pragmatism comes into these judgments. We realize that whenever you're dealing with interventions outside the NHS, in the real world, the gold standard randomized controlled trial might not be the optimum design to answer the question. So we take a pragmatic view of this. So we're looking for the top quality science, but in context. We have a program advisory board, of which you'll hear more later, which helps us think about the needs of the community, both policymakers and practitioners working in practice, to see where the evidence gaps are and what will make a difference to their day-to-day work. Increasingly, all the funders, not just NIHR, are going beyond individually focused interventions which might change behaviours, because we know there are so many other determinants of our behaviour, whether they be regional and national policies, or, like Andrew said, access to alcohol outlets and whatever. Some of these things are operating at a population level. So our board and the other funders are increasingly looking for these population level interventions. And you would expect that a panel like ours, because of what I've just said, needs to have a broad range of expertise on the panel. And indeed, in my 8 years working on the panel, we have had people from many different disciplines, from health economics, from various types of social science, from particular subject specialisms, physical activity, nutrition, or schools-based work. And we regularly look at the makeup of the panel whenever people's term of office comes to an end, and we look at where the gaps are to ensure we have the expertise to make the judgments. You will see in the application forms that there is a section to make you think about dissemination and pathways to impact. Please don't ignore those sections of the application form. We have people, as I say, who are working with practitioners in the local communities, and we want to see where the opportunities are to scale up the intervention and to actually make a real translation and impact in the real world. So we're looking for scientific quality in context. I'm not saying that an RCT is going to be the best design in all contexts. Feasibility, I would say that in the screening and remit check phase, that we're looking for what's plausible, because sometimes what's presented, we make a judgment that, this plausibly will not take root or get traction with practitioners. So we do look for feasibility. And value for money, there isn't a magic cut-off threshold for, as Gemma said, for value for money. Occasionally, we will look at the cost per participant. The figure might come to our mind when we're comparing the cost of one proposal versus another. But there isn't a magic threshold because research in different fields poses many different logistical challenges. So you wouldn't expect it to be equally on the same field, so to speak, in terms of value for money. I've already said that we regularly refresh the membership of our panel to ensure it has a good mix of disciplines and special interests. So, common feedback points that get fed back to applicants who may not have been successful. We're looking for a clear rationale and an identified need. Now, when people survey the literature, particular research questions pose different grades of difficulty. I and the panel look for honesty because maybe one of the judgments we make is, is this a realistic appraisal of the difficult questions in this area and looking at how we would address them. So we're looking for the identified need and why this particular research question should be prioritized. We are interested in feasibility and pilot stages because often people, I'm not saying often perhaps, but we're cautious not to see people jumping too quickly to a full definitive trial. And there are two approaches to this. Some researchers may choose to do a full trial with an embedded internal pilot, in which case the panel will often look for very robust progression criteria or stop-go criteria for the internal pilot. Personally, I prefer to see research in a staged process. So I would prefer to see a robust feasibility and pilot stage upon which the researchers and the panel can make a judgment before people jump into the definitive trial. As Gemma and Andrew have said, we're not always looking for a randomized controlled trial, but sometimes the researchers forget about things which should be taken into account, like the clustering of effects, whether it's at school level or a key worker who's delivering a service to a group of people. So we're asking you to think very carefully about the design, and I'm sure Chris will say a few words about that in a moment. Stop-go criteria. You can go to the website and you will find a set of draft stop-go or progression criteria. And there are not very many hard thresholds in that list, like you must recruit at a certain rate per month, or attrition must be no greater than 10%. There are no firm figures there, because again, the panel will make a judgment in context, because research in different fields poses different logistical challenges. But we do want the researchers to think very carefully about recruitment strategies, because often that's where the real world intervention will fail, about whether you can reach your target audience. And we're asking you to think about the target audience very carefully, because we're very keen about the reach of our interventions, particularly the reach across socioeconomic groups. And very often people from more deprived backgrounds will be the harder to reach. So when you're thinking about a recruitment strategy, take that into account. We have very skilled statisticians serving on the board and always have done, so they will read carefully what you've written about sample size. If I may say, there's no magic sample size for a pilot study. There's a lot of good work being done by a number of groups funded by MRC and others to think about sample size for pilot studies, but I wouldn't say there's a hard and fast or algorithmic answer to the sample size for a pilot study. But we are asking people to think about the scaling up. I mean, although the researchers may wish to do a trial in context, the panel thinks about whether this, if it worked, would have traction in the real world. So we are asking you at this stage to think about that question, not to produce a definitive answer, but think about what would determine the scale up or transferability of your trial results. Now, clearly, we're speaking today from an RDS, and often we will look to see the involvement, the close involvement of a CTU in your trial, if it is a trial. In particular, the one thing I would ask you to think about is if you are doing a pilot or an embedded pilot, we look for an independent trial steering committee, and there may well be people from a CTU who would help in an independent trial steering committee, but the stop-go decision should not be left to the researcher themselves. That has to be done by an independent body like a trial steering committee. Value for money, I've already said that there isn't a hard ceiling here. We're looking for value for money in terms of, well, is the team right? Perhaps there's a rugby team on the application, you know, and that we'll make a judgment. Well, why are all these people on this? Have you duplicated expertise where it needn't have been duplicated? So whilst there isn't a hard ceiling or cap, we will look at the mix of the expertise, whether it's too much, whether it's too little. And we're looking for a broad mix, including practitioners who have a foot in the real world. Now, a common piece of feedback that we give is that the intervention hasn't been soundly theoretically grounded from the outset. Obviously, if you're doing a feasibility and pilot, you're given the opportunity to revise your logic model, and that would be an endpoint, one of the endpoints of a feasibility and pilot stage, that you have revised your logic model and you know that your outcome measures and your intermediate or mediating measures also make sense. I've mentioned the SES reach, or the socioeconomic reach of your study. We're very keen that the trials and the studies that we commission are going to have an impact on health inequalities as well as an overall public health or population impact. Please don't forget the health economic assessment as a parallel part of your study. We have experienced health economists on the panel. And like I said, for the trialists and the statisticians on the panel, they're not guided by dogma that there's only one type of health economic assessment that can be done. It doesn't have to be a nice health or cost utility piece of modelling. It could be a return on investment or a cost consequence model. So our health economists are quite prepared to think more broadly than just the standard NICE model. As I've already mentioned, the importance of thinking about the pathway to impact. Just a few final closing remarks from me about responding to the board if you get through to the full submission stage of your application. The board will, by that stage, have given you detailed feedback, and I've mentioned some of the points already that may well be reflected to the applicants. And the DBMs, the designated board members who are reading your resubmission at the full stage, will have that feedback in front of them, and they will look carefully about how you've addressed it. Please don't ignore what you've been told by the board. And if you may not agree with it, and that's okay if you don't agree with it, but justify your position then and say, this is why I didn't agree with that piece of feedback, but don't ignore it. And do it as fully as possible, because the omissions will be spotted. And if there's still a question or a doubt in your mind, Gemma and Andrew and the team back in Southampton are there to answer your questions. Pick up the phone and speak to one of them, and that's the best way to resolve any uncertainty. So thank you. And I'm going to hand over at this point to Professor Chris Owen from St George's, Professor of Epidemiology, one of our panel members.
Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Well, good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me here today to talk to you. As Frank outlined, I'm an epidemiologist at St George's, University of London. There we are. And I've been a board member for about 2 years, and I am on both sides of the camp. So I'm a board member, and I've also had success with the NIHR programme. So hopefully I'm going to relay some of those aspects to you today and give a slightly different view, perhaps with a slightly different accent to Frank, but just give you a different view from the other side of the camp in terms of perhaps how one might go about having success with getting funding. So This slide has already been covered partly by Gemma in terms of the generic funding that NIHR provides. It provides research capacity to improve patient and public health, and it will consider multiple methodologies. It doesn't fund discovery science, and neither does it have any funding for animals or animal-related research. In terms of the PHR program, which Gemma has covered, it funds evaluations of non-NHS interventions intended to improve the health of the public. And as already covered, it is unable to fund intervention costs. So those interventions costs have to come from elsewhere. It's a national program open to all UK researchers, and it includes both qualitative and quantitative based research, and essentially is evaluating the effectiveness of cost-effective public health interventions. And I think Gemma covered this very nicely. It is covering areas that are health related, and if there's any confusion over that, then obviously liaise with the team. This slide has already been shown. I just want to take it a little bit further. So we have two areas of research. We have researcher-led programs, which are initiated by the researchers themselves. Again, this is non-HS, it's researcher-led, it's primary research or evidence synthesis, so systematic reviews and the such. And also there are commissioned briefs that come out. Just to give you a little bit more detail on this, there are the following on the PHR website, which is extremely useful. I found it very useful, I learned a few things. But this is currently the calls that are out with expiring in November of this year. So changing drinking behaviours, promoting independence among older people and disabled people, which has already been mentioned, digital interventions for sexual health promotion, and you've got details of the researcher-led programme, but also the researcher-led evidence synthesis programme there as well. And this is really handy. If you click on one of these, it provides you further details about the commission brief, it gives guidance and the such. And this is the type of information, I'm not expecting you to see any of this, but this is the type of information that you will then be given access to in the form of a PDF. But it states the primary aim of the call. So for instance here, interventions in built and natural and social environments to change behaviour, norms and minimise harms associated with drinking alcohol. It gives you what they are seeking to look for, and also it gives some examples of the type of studies that they might be interested in funding. So it gives you clear direction from the website. As already stated, it doesn't fund the intervention costs. So those intervention costs have to come from elsewhere. We know the challenges of that. As I say, I work on both sides of the fence, and we are having difficulties getting intervention costs funded, but you need to take that into consideration. So the public health programme will not fund the intervention itself. It will not fund the creation of new interventions, and this is quite useful text again from the PHR website if you're unsure whether your intervention should be funded or should not. It won't fund the creation of new interventions or processes where active components of an existing intervention essentially are being reassembled or recombined to create a new intervention. And sometimes on the board we have struggled with this, and we've now sought to clarify that. So if you're unsure, just go to the website and seek the information, or go to the PHR advisors for further information. It will not fund the design and development of new websites, apps and text messages and other software which may be part of a new intervention of some sort. And we're seeing probably more of these as time goes by. In terms of developmental studies, the PHR will fund studies with a developmental element to them. But if you've got a new intervention and you want to look, the first stage is to go to the Public Health Intervention Development Scheme, and I popped the website there for further information. That has been set up to pump prime potential interventions which then might be evaluated through the PHR programme. So go to that website if you've got a new intervention which you want to develop. What makes a good application? And when I read them, it's very quickly, it's just a good idea. You know, if it's something that's a public health need and there is a plausible way of dealing with it, and you've got an idea of how you might overcome it, then that's great. And quickly when I read a proposal, I'm looking for a good idea. So it's it's in your interest to try and bounce it off colleagues perhaps and say, well, look, I think I've got a new way of dealing with this problem or evaluating this problem. What do you think? And if some people say, yes, that's good, then I think you're onto a winner. And very quickly, when I read a proposal, I am looking to be punched in the face with a good idea, as it were. So think in that way. And in terms of the application process, there is a lot of rigor. It's very transparent. And this is a flow diagram, again, taken from the PHR website. It's a two-stage system. So if you put in an outline application, either in response to the commission brief or the researcher-led program, it is firstly checked to make sure it's suitable. And once it's gone through those checks, it then goes to the program advisory board, which are largely public health physicians and the such. It then is invited for an outline application, which then is sent to the research funding board to see if it's suitable for further progression. It then becomes a full proposal. It's then peer reviewed by statisticians, methodologists, economists and the such. And those reports feed into the research funding board, which will then look at the proposal and also all those peer reviews that have been done on that full proposal. And then a decision is made whether it is funded with changes, resubmit, maybe if there's something we feel there's promise with it, but it could be recast in some way, we can invite it to be resubmitted, or it can be rejected. Obviously, if it's funded with changes, we then review those changes, and then it goes through to funding. This point has already been made that the PHR seeks to be needs-led and then science added. So in other words, the Programme Advisory Board in a large degree sets some of the questions that the PHR answers, and then the job of the Research Funding Board is whether that proposal can actually answer those questions. So that gives you an idea of the stage system. Just to point out, there is a fast track system where you can bypass the outline. If there is perhaps a natural experiment, something's being built and it's being built right now and you need to get into the field quickly, then there is a fast track option that can be applied for, which bypasses the outline stage. So you can go straight in at a full proposal stage, however, it will still go through that form of assessment. Okay, is the research question in remit? So that's the first stage. Is there an intervention? Are the intervention costs funded, which is obviously a prerequisite? Is it delivered outside of the NHS? And is the primary outcome measure health related? And does it meet the commissioning brief? As I say, if you're not sure, liaise with the team down in Southampton. In terms of the question being important, is there a public health need? Has that been explicitly stated in the proposal? Will the research provide the evidence needed for decision makers? And does it address an important public health issue? And how will the results reduce inequalities in health? That could either be primarily by the research itself, especially if it's primary research, or it might be that you're doing it in a certain group, but you talk about potential generalizability to other populations and the such. So you either directly deal with that or say how it might be done. And the most important thing, is it transferable to other populations? So other age groups perhaps, different ethnic groups and the such. And has the research question been explained and the importance of the topic clearly made? Is it feasible? We are looking for ambitious proposals and we appreciate that they come with expense, but if it is ambitious, can it deliver? Is it realistic in its aims? Is the presentation of methods appropriate for the particular research question that you want to answer? And have you justified the recruitment methods and assumptions? This is where pilot work is very helpful, in that if you have a proposed form of recruitment and you carried out a pilot and you delivered that recruitment already, then we tick a box and we can move forward. You also need to explain the sample size calculations. So by that, we have statisticians on the board who are looking for an effect size you might want to find, and that your study is sufficiently powered in order to find that effect size. And is the experience, track record and appropriateness of your fellow investigators appropriate, which has already been covered by Frank. So as part of the submission, when you get to the full proposal stage, you have to write something called a project description. And bear in mind, we're reading a lot of these and we're looking for a structure to them, essentially. So we encourage you to use headings, use clear, simple, succinct, logical language that we can follow. And it's good to cover these sort of bases. So who are you going to include in your study? What is the intervention perhaps you want to investigate? Who are going to be your control population? Where is it going to be carried out? What are your primary and secondary outcomes? So you might have something of primary interest, but you can also look at a number of other things. It's important to state those. And as I already said, the sample size and power of the study is very important, especially as on the board, we've got to check that there is sufficient sample size for you to deliver the work and potentially answer the question. And you also need to outline the statistical analysis that you're going to carry out within the proposal. So that's just, you might have other headings, you might want to modify that in some way, but essentially those are the bases that need to be covered. And that's what we look for when we're reviewing the proposals. As I say, it's great if you have a pilot study which you conclude, especially if you're moving to a full proposal, to check, if you like, in principle, you've done what you say you can do. And we also fund feasibility in pilot studies. And as Frank outlined, that could either be in its own right, so you can do a pilot study before moving to a full proposal, or we have combined project proposals that do a feasibility or pilot study and then move to a full proposal. But progression criteria are clearly outlined, and that's been covered already. And as we keep saying, we don't fund new interventions. We do fund modifications of interventions where there is good need or a good case is made for them to be modified. I think that's fair. Yeah, I've made that point. So picking your team. As Frank said, we don't want a rugby team unless the rugby team, everyone needs to be there in order to win, but we need to outline who needs to be a part of that team, and the description of what everyone is going to do needs to be clear. We suggest involvement of a CTU or RDS from the beginning, so when you're forming the proposal, we always look for that, making sure that the correct expertise essentially is there as the study is formed. We need to comment on the track record and the experience of the team and their appropriateness and the contribution they will make to this particular piece of work. And their roles and responsibilities need to be outlined. You do need to make sure you've got sufficient statistical support. As we said, there are statisticians on the board. We don't want tokenistic involvement of a statistician at an end stage. A statistician needs to be involved from the start to make sure that the study is sufficiently powered or is able to deliver the aims that it outlines. Where appropriate, we also need health economists and qualitative researchers if these are questions that you also want to look at within the course of the proposal. And obviously with a randomized controlled trial of some sort, if you're doing that, you'll need a steering group, and you may also need a patient advisory group if you are introducing an intervention where you want to gauge what those that are delivering the intervention feel in terms of receiving that intervention. This question has already been asked about, or partly answered, about how much you can ask for. I put a but in mine. The only but is obviously you've got to consider what the price is per person, if you like, and there is only a certain amount of funding. If a high level of funding is needed to answer a specific question, and that question is of considerable public health importance, it will receive funding. But you need to think about how much you actually need to deliver a certain program of work. So for instance, I don't want to be tied down in costs, but if you have a pilot study that's a sort of million plus, then obviously that just isn't going to wash. You need to think also about looking at the website to see perhaps what typical values are given for funding for various projects and whether yours is above and below that, and also consider whether there is a case for you being paid more or less than that. So it's got to be seen in relation to other studies that have been funded. And is it realistically costed, and does it give good value for money? yeah, the bottom line is the cost to address the disease or health issue in question justified, and have you provided sufficient justification for that? Okay, PPI. PPI, again, can't be tokenistic. It has key importance in terms of a project proposal, and PPI needs to be formed as you form the question, not just at the end. So you need to involve patients and the publics during the development and as well as the delivery of the project. So that's important. And patients and public need to be involved at all stages of the proposal. And the funding boards will explicitly look for evidence of appropriate PPI within the proposal. So this can't just be given a cursory consideration. This needs to be formed fully. And you also need to think about how you're going to disseminate the results of the study in order of hitting those potential stakeholders and others that might be affected by a potential intervention that you're looking at, or you might be wishing to roll out on a more general population level. How will people get to know about your research? And you can think inventively of ways that you might be able to do that in order to hit the maximum number of people possible. We provide feedback when we assess the proposals, and it's just to say this is supposed to be helpful. We're not trying to be irritating, we're trying to help the proposal answer the question in a better way. So it's a good idea to respond to all of the issues that we raise, and sometimes on the board we raise issues, and indeed in the response to those they're not even addressed. It's just sort of shoved under the carpet. So if we do make a suggestion, there are good reasons around the board why we think that suggestion is important, and it's important for you to consider the points that we've raised. As Frank outlined, you might think we are wrong, which is fine. You just need to outline the case why you think we are wrong. And essentially, anyone who has an application should respond to all the highlighted areas, either in a positive, or if you feel that's not the way it should go, justifying why you think not. Just in terms of the board, we're not all quite as groomed as this, but we have a mixture of people on the board. So we have behavioural scientists, economics represented, epidemiologists. We also have a number of lay members. We have policy experts. We have public health specialists. We have psychologists, sociologists, and statisticians. So if you have a proposal that involves certain areas of this, essentially we have it covered. So you need to go into a sufficient level of depth in order for these people to be satisfied that what you're saying is correct, and that this is important, or this will work. Just to go through briefly some of the pitfalls. If you don't answer the research question, that's a problem. And often there is inadequate detail given to the public health importance of the issue you wish to look at. There's inadequate detail given on the intervention that's going to be evaluated, and there's a lack of development or feasibility work within the application for us to think that this could actually work. There may be insufficient detail from response to the feedback from the board, so we need to look at that. And there might be unrealistic or inaccurate costings, and that works in both ways. Sometimes we see proposals that look too cheap. Often, though, I would say they often look too expensive, but there you go. And often the submissions have not been proofread. I think from my perspective and my success, I actually got, everyone's under a lot of burden at the moment, but if you can get someone else in your institute or your department, or indeed your wife, which I did, to just read the proposal and check that it makes sense, then I think that's a good idea, because often they pick up things and you think, oh gosh, that is confusing, isn't it? So make sure it reads well and that it makes sense. There are sometimes inconsistent accounts of the planned research, or the study design simply won't answer the question. Often where that's the case and we think it has potential, we'll suggest perhaps other types of study design which might answer it better. So try and just step back and think, well, why are they thinking of that? Could that be better than what I've suggested? And see if you could encompass that or defend it. there are often incorrect or inconsistent numbers. And this is inevitable, and it is a nightmare in that you've got different parts of the form that you have to fill in, and that numbers in one part don't correspond to the other. But that comes back to the proofreading of it to make sure all the numbers are internally consistent. You know, we need 1,000 people here, and then it says 2,000 here. So you just want to make sure everything tallies up nicely and is squared away. Always a problem if there is a major piece of work that has covered an area that you're interested in that is not cited. And bearing in mind the panel there, if there is a piece of work that exists, they're probably aware of it. So make sure you've covered all the most relevant recent literature related to the work. And often we'll check to see if anyone else is doing something that you're planning to do to make sure it's distinct. Well, I do. Insufficient detail or unclear, particularly in the methodology sections, even at full proposal stage, this can happen. At outline stage, there isn't enough room sometimes to expand on things. The full proposal is seeking to give that further information, so make sure it's there. And as there might be a rugby team which might be considered too much, there can also be too little. And there might be areas within the proposal that we feel you need further expertise to cover. And often we'll make that recommendation if the reviewer's comments comes back. I've raised the issue of PPI and also the potential need for including qualitative and economic analysts. This slide was just to say, having been on both sides of the fence, I know what it's like to be under the water as well as above the water. And, you know, forgive us when comments come back, but we are very aware of the hard work and everything that goes into a proposal. What we're seeking to do is to make the difference between being below the water and success. So please bear with us and bear with the comments that we make. It is purely so that we have good science coming through the programme. Just in terms of your chances of success, I thought I'd put this in. And this is again available from the website. So these are your chances. So for 2016-2017, there were 134 proposals that were submitted, and about 70% of those got through the first stage. And so let's call that about 100. Essentially, a third are shortlisted, and if you are shortlisted, it's about 50-50 whether you will be funded. This is just in terms of numbers. Obviously, all the factors that I've outlined is what makes you that 50%. So of those that are initially submitted, about a sixth will get funded. I just thought that was useful to know. I mean, this is not indifferent from other funding boards. And if you look at the funding over the period that is outlined on this website, you can see there's a bit of fluctuation, a bit of variation, but it's fairly consistent over time. Over to my colleague.
Thank you, Chris. So the last presentation of the morning is to give you a broad overview of the support the Research Design Service can provide. So as you may be aware, we're a national service which is regionally delivered. Each region in England has its own Research Design Service, and we're here to support those developing research grant applications for national peer-reviewed funding streams, and predominantly that is for the NIHR streams, although we have been given the latitude to support more widely, so we provide support for charity schemes or research councils as appropriate. Our aim is to increase the volume and proportion of high quality grant applications, and we do this by providing bespoke project specific guidance on research design and health research methods. Although our support is often much broader than this, we help teams identify a most suitable funding stream and prepare appropriate applications. We always review team composition and assess where the gaps might be and introduce to suitable collaborators. We appreciate the importance of patient and public involvement and involving patients at a very early stage in the design of studies. We help get the narrative right, so we can work with you on presenting the evidence and the rationale and presenting a good case for benefit and of impact. And we also can help and with resubmissions as well, so looking at the feedback from panels and how to respond appropriately to that. The service is bespoke. We tailor it to individuals' needs, but there are three general approaches to providing support through an RDS. Initially, there is very much a general review, so we're working with you to develop your idea, look at the study aims, look at the quality of the research question, who's in the team, the overall design of the study, as mentioned earlier, bringing in patient and public involvement at a very early stage. So we have frontline advisors who will work with you to develop these aspects and also provide a very important triage function and introduce you to more specialists within the research design service who will then give more detailed feedback on maybe areas of statistics, sample size, with an economist for proposals with economic evaluations, and maybe even mixed methods approaches as well. We can also facilitate additional support. We have close links with trials units and members of trust R&D departments, so we can link you and streamline the process of getting you access to any additional support that you might need. Information on how to access our service is predominantly through the websites. We have a national RDS website which links out to all the regions. You can request our advice through the website, subscribe to some of our publications, our e-bulletins and newsletters, hear news of our various events. We do lots of outreach events, drop-in sessions, workshops aligned with funding streams, etc. And also we have a range of online resources which can also be found to help you develop your study. Key message from us is that we'd like to see you as early as possible, so do contact us when you're at the idea stage. Ideally we would work with you over several months ahead of a submission deadline. As a guide, I would say 2 to 3 months is a good time frame for some really good input. So do visit the website, do look for your regional RDS and contact them for support at a very early stage. So that's the last slide of the morning. Can I just say that we have got a feedback form which we'll be sending out to all of those who are logged in online, and there's feedback forms here in the room as well. We would like to hear your thoughts on the presentations and also the subsequent Q&A session now. So I'd now like to invite the panel members to come up to the front. We're going to rearrange slightly and we'll start the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have had 2 further members join the panel, and can I ask Toby and Jill to just briefly introduce themselves?
I'm Toby Prebbo, I'm a Professor of Medical Statistics at Imperial College London, and I am one of the board members for the PHR.
I'm Jill Russell, and I'm a Senior Lecturer in Health Policy and Evaluation at Queen Mary, University of London, and I'm the RDS Qualitative Methods Lead.
Great, thank you. So as mentioned earlier, we have had a few questions submitted online prior to the event. We thought we'd start running through some of those to start with. We have covered the issue of funding for intervention costs, and that was one of the questions which came through. Could the panel actually give some feedback on where that funding might be obtained if the programme can't provide it?
So, classically, we'd expect the people who might pay for the intervention should it be demonstrated to work and be implemented to cover that. So classically that's local authorities. Obviously these days it was much easier 10 years ago than it is now as far as local authorities are concerned. Usually where that works best now is where you have a situation where some local authorities are providing a service and some aren't. That gives you an opportunity for natural experiment. or where there's a disinvestment process going on. So you measure the withdrawal of a service rather than the implementation of a new one. The other classic places people go are charities. So often charities have a particular interest in something, and they might have developed the intervention, or they may be willing to pay for the intervention if it meets their charitable aims.
Great, okay. Is there anything else to add to that? Okay, great. We heard about the programme funding feasibility studies. I wonder if you could give just a few examples of some feasibility aims which are addressed through the PHR programme.
Well, maybe the language that's used in applications sometimes gets confused. I regard feasibility study as the first test of the intervention. So for a pure feasibility study, there may not be a control group, there may not be a randomized pilot. But what you want to work out or answer the question is whether the intervention can be delivered in the way that you designed it, whether it has a logic model that makes sense whenever you try it out with the real practitioners, with the real people that you're trying to recruit. So we're looking largely for that early feasibility stage to say, does the intervention actually work as planned? People then might go on after that stage to do a randomized pilot, and I can answer that question later, or other panelists may.
The other key thing is also useful sometimes to find out is, can you collect the data that you need? So even if you can deliver the intervention, if the people who received it then either can't tell you what happened to their quality of life or whether their exercise habits change, then the subsequent trial becomes impractical. So it's about testing, can you deliver the intervention, and can you then get the data back from the people that you're talking to? And sometimes people will try and collect a lot more data with the view of picking a subset of that for a subsequent project.
I was just going to make the point, reiterating, but if you say you could reach so many people with this intervention, the pilot should show that you can reach those people, and also that if you have this intervention, that it is taken up by people and you know, is successful. So it's a very important first step before we move to a full trial.
We heard during the presentations about the MRC scheme, the Public Health Intervention Development Scheme. Could the panel maybe give some examples of distinctions between what the PHR would fund and what the MRC scheme would fund?
I sit on the FIND panel as well, so that's actually useful to our panel because I get a flavour of what's going to each panel. And Gemma was exactly right. Our panel won't fund the development of a new intervention, and that is the jurisdiction of the FIND panel. So they're looking for, the FIND panel's looking for, to use the hackneyed phrase, more blue skies thinking, to move out of our comfort zone and devise something new. At what Chris said, a good idea. And FIND is looking for fresh ideas to devise something entirely new to address. Now they're looking for, ultimately to achieve the same aims that we're achieving, looking for both population impact and the impact on inequalities. FIND think about those two things as well. FIND, if you look at their portfolio, and correct me if I'm wrong, Gemma, but maybe a fifth have been global health projects. Maybe a fifth of what they have funded have been global health projects, which our scheme doesn't largely do. So they're looking at things in underdeveloped countries as well, but they're looking for novelty.
I was just going to ask Frank, could you clarify whether under the FIND system they actually get the cost for the intervention?
I'll say yes to that, but at this stage, I mean, because one of the ones that we were looking at yesterday built in the cost of vouchers, which were part of the intervention. So I will say yes to that at this very early stage, because it's meant to be a new intervention.
But there is a cap.
There's a cap on the scheme. It's about 150k over 18 months for the FIND scheme, 150k, and that's a solid cap.
There's a slightly fuzzy boundary there, because we talked about established interventions which you can roll out and test, and then new blue skies thinking. There's a bit in the middle where you've picked up an intervention from somewhere else, so maybe there's something that's been shown to work in America and you want to test it here. Or maybe you've got an intervention that's been shown to reduce smoking and you want to know if it can reduce alcohol, but it needs a bit of tweaking because you need to cross out cigarettes and put beer in the instructions. So what PHR will do in those circumstances, if you need a small bit of tweaking or modification, PHR will support that. But no more than a few months. If it can need more than a few months, it probably is fine. But if it's a question of, here's something American, we need to anglicise it, we need a few months of your focus groups and collaborative work, that's the sort of thing that will probably come to PHR. As we said earlier, if you're in doubt, we're on the end of the phone and email, so do get in contact and we can give you a steer as to where any proposal might best fit.
We had just a specific point about epidemiological work, and would that fit within the remit of PHR?
Epidemiological work is quite broad. Are we sort of thinking about systematic reviews, evidence synthesis, and that type of project? Yes, so the PHR programme will fund evidence synthesis and systematic reviews, especially if there's a gap in the literature somewhere where we need to investigate a certain research question. Often that might be the first stage to, if we're going down an intervention route, may not be, but if we're trying to develop one, we need to look at the literature as it currently stands. So often that will be a pump primer perhaps to further work, which will then say, well, this is where the gap in the literature is suggesting that this is the best way forward. We then may have a study design that forms from that, which then moves in that direction.
So we don't fund descriptive epidemiology. So if you want to go and find out how many alcoholics there are in Cambridge, no. But so the evidence synthesis that we would fund would be looking at and comparing interventions, possibly against no intervention, but there must always be an intervention in there somewhere.
Is there a question from the audience? I'd like to ask a question. Can I just pass you the microphone?
Thank you very much. My name is Sarvasha and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at Guy's and St Thomas's NHS Trust London, and I've got two questions. First question is, NIHR funds local and national research projects. Does NIHR funds any projects undertaken in developed countries, like on any public health issues? And the second question is, are there any services for using RDS services, or any costs? Thank you.
As a general rule, NIHR, and especially the Public Health Research Programme, generally only funds, if it's primary research, it will only fund work done in the UK. So the requirement is whatever findings have to affect practice in the UK. Now, sometimes you might need to go a little bit beyond that. Now, that happens more commonly in other NIHR programmes. If you can imagine, in the Health Technology Assessment Programme, if you're replacing a hip, we replace a hip very similarly in France and Germany and the UK, so knowledge from hip replacements in European countries is probably generalisable to the UK. But the social circumstances around a public health intervention are so different. I mean, say you know an intervention reduces pregnancy rates in France, the chances that that's directly transferable to the UK are pretty low. So it wouldn't be completely unheard of, but you'd have to make a solid justification for doing work outside the country. But the results have to be directly applicable to UK practice.
And if I could add to that, Chris alluded to the different accents. The home nations arrangements may, local arrangements, for example, local authorities are distinct from our public health agency, but they work very, very closely. So local arrangements are different in different parts of the UK. And if you're doing a pilot of a new intervention, the panel's probably thinking, well, would this only work in Truro and Cornwall? Would it work in London or Belfast? So we do think about those questions, whether a locally designed intervention would have scale up. So it's often good to think of that question and to think of, well, should the pilot be a multi-centre pilot, to at least have some early demonstration that practice is similar enough that the intervention could be scaled up. So we are interested in national interventions. Obviously they may be generated locally, but we would ask the researchers to think about that scale up.
In terms of the support available, we do support teams with international collaborators, and as long as you're eligible for one of the NIHR schemes or a national peer review scheme, we can support you. Any more questions from the room?
Hi, I'm Marta Canfield, and I'm a postdoc research associate at King's College and also RDS General Advisor at King's. About the team, the PI, is some early career researchers can be a PI, or you need some PI with more experience in the field? How is that? Or can have a mentor as well?
Yes. I think one of the things that we would look at first is whether the person is on a short-term contract. I mean, if the person is likely to be insecure during the timescale of the project, that makes us think twice probably. But we're not averse to having early career researchers as PIs, providing the mentorship is there in the team to support that person. So, I mean, we have had applications from relatively junior researchers, but they've made it clear that there's a solid expert team around them providing the mentorship. Maybe we want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and often if we've got a good idea and it's from a more junior researcher, they may not have mentoring. We will say, this is a good idea, but we wish to see more mentoring or a mechanism by which that individual will be mentored through the process. So in it, you just need to define who's going to support you. So usually we have a junior, but then there's a more senior straight away behind them in support.
And we would expect we would pay for that time. So if there's a professor of whatever down a couple of % for mentoring, we would expect that to appear as a cost in the grant. So we don't expect the mentors to do it for nothing. We'll pay their time. This is part of, in 20 years' time, the mentor will have retired and the new front person will be the professor of whatever it is, and we'd like them to be there in 20 years' time applying to our programme.
Thank you.
Behind you there, Peter.
Thank you. I'm Ellen Donovan, a General Advisor in South East. I just wondered, are the board interested in getting suggestions for potential commission calls from the community? Is there a mechanism for that?
Yes, yes, very much so. So anyone can suggest a topic that they feel needs or an area of research that's necessary. You can do that via the website, or you can just email the programme. So yes, please do.
Or if you have an account on the management information systems, if you've been an applicant in the past, when you log in and a menu on the left, I think the second thing on the list is suggest an idea. So just click that and fill in the boxes. But yeah, happy to get ideas from anyone. We don't guarantee that they'll be advertised, but we're very happy to see everything.
And we will keep you in contact with you in regards to the development of that topic idea and whether it actually results in some research that's funded.
There was a related question which asked which areas of public health research deserve more attention. Is that something you could comment on?
Yeah, so what our Programme Advisory Board has felt isn't actually topic areas per se, it's the level of intervention. So what they want to see are more population level evaluations. So the typical thing that comes along is an individual level intervention presented in a cluster randomised trial with probably schools as that's our average study. It's a cluster randomised trial in schools of an individual behaviour intervention. And the board just feels that there is probably more scope and power in a more population level intervention, which probably wouldn't be a trial. Because those are things that you may well not be able to randomise. So there isn't a topic level, there's not a topic area particularly we see more of it, it's the approach. We're still open to these individual level interventions, but we would very much like to see more population level evaluations.
Is it worth just mentioning we're seeing more natural experiments which take advantage of maybe a big change in the built environment or a new train line going in or something of that sort. So in other words, the intervention is there. I mean, it's more challenging actually to see what the effect on the local population is in some ways because they're less captive, but we are seeing more and more of these coming through.
And we do have some wording on the website around large-scale interventions, encouraging applications for them, complex systems. So there is something on the website that sort of backs that up, I suppose.
Great. Okay. I think with the there was a HA program who promoted efficient study designs a couple of years ago. Is that something the program's looking for as well?
I think we were well ahead of HTA.
Okay.
I said I work for HTA as well some of the time. So if you look at our portfolio, I said our classic trial design is a cluster trial. But we probably have 10 or 20% of the project, of the primary research projects, as natural experiments. Yeah. We have a number of interesting statistics that I struggle with, which is why I'm glad we have sort of statisticians on the board, to take advantage of those natural experiments. But yeah, if you can be efficient, please do. Yeah. I mean, we touched on value for money earlier, and if you have the right circumstances, an efficient design should give you better value for money. Yeah. And more power to answer a question while exposing fewer people to the uncertainty of your research. Yeah. So we're keen.
Yeah. And Toby, from your experience, how are those designs accepted by the panel?
Well, I think they sort of evolved over the past 5 or 10 years. Previously, quite a lot of that type of research was just before or after studies without any natural control to compare against, and so that's very important to have control and think very carefully about the control group. I think over time more studies have thought about not just introducing concurrent control, but also trying to consider how to improve what situations that have been analysed using observational designs. And so, for example, the interrupted time series is one design that's come in over the recent couple of years or so to the board, which is a method that allows you to assess whether the trajectory of a particular of the outcome might actually change when the intervention comes in, and in a more robust way.
Thank you. We obviously all talked about stakeholder involvement. There was a specific question about could we actually give some examples of suitable stakeholder involvement.
I think we've got the FIT studies, football fans in training, which was on one of Andrew's slides. That project had really good stakeholder involvement from word go with the football teams, and I think that really showed in the success of the project. But not only the project that we funded, but where the project has now gone and the intervention and how the interventions developed. So they had buy-in from a very early stage. That would be one. Another one, I think, is the street lights. So the turning off of street lights systematically throughout the evening. They had engagement from local authorities from the word go, and what they had to be able to access data from the local authorities. So that's another good example.
I think what Gemma said, having them involved from an early stage is the key point, and through the different stages of the research. For example, there may be circumstances where the PPI stakeholder partners will help you choose the primary outcome from a range of outcomes that you could prioritise, and the PPI voice is very important there.
Okay. Let's check for further questions. Lindsay?
Well, I have a question. Sorry. My name's Lindsay Forbes. I'm from Research Fellow from the University of Kent and also an RDS advisor. I have a question about the remit of the funding stream in terms of analytical epidemiological projects. And you said clearly that it's mainly about interventions or natural experiments and not descriptive epidemiology, but there is of course another level of epidemiology, as Chris alluded to. It's a very broad question, but I'm talking about observational analytical epidemiology. For example, if you had a study that wanted to examine the health effects of an environmental influence such as air pollution, water quality, but there isn't an actual change. There isn't an actual change, either a natural experiment. It's just trying to understand the environment that exists already better and what health effects it might be having.
To me, that sounds like descriptive epidemiology, although it might invoke some powerful analytic techniques, but we're looking for things that change the outcomes, not just the existing set of risk factors, but things like a change in legislation or
a hazard that has been introduced or whatever?
I think the key thing is you need to be able to identify something that could conceivably be described as an intervention. Now that might not yet have been applied. You can imagine with air pollution, let's say, you could measure the health of people who live next to an airport and then the health of people who didn't, and using your clever epidemiological techniques, come to the conclusion that the only difference between these areas was the pollution coming out of the jets. And then you could imagine an intervention such that you could change the engines, you could close the airport. So that then sort of squeezes itself into the remit, provided provided there's an intervention that could plausibly be delivered. Now that might not be the best example because I don't think people are going to be closing down Heathrow in the near future. But it's possible that you could then use that to inform your planning decisions on a new airport. So it's the sort of thing you would have to, I'd say talk fast, but you write this all down. It's the sort of thing you could justify in terms of, here is something that would inform policy. It might not be an intervention in the same way that putting a new hip into someone is an intervention, but you could see how a policymaker could act on it, even in the current environment. The government could close Heathrow if it really, really wanted to. It seems pretty unlikely. It's a more challenging thing to justify as being in remit, but I could see that it possibly could be. But it's people like Frank you have to convince.
And that's the kind of question I think that you should ask in advance of starting the application. So email us, tell us your argument, and then if we feel it's not sufficient enough to fly as such with the board, then we'll say no, we suggest you go elsewhere, or we'll direct you to the RDS to get advice as to where to go.
In all these edge cases, we've got an email address which is probably on the slide somewhere, we've got a phone number, do get in contact. We're always very happy to talk to people.
We often do get questions about scope and remit, and one of the questions we received again before the session was the case where would PHR fund non-NHS screening if then the positive case is required NHS treatment?
So potentially yes. So the sort of situation I imagined was someone wants to set up, the local authority wants to set up screening for hypertension in their local leisure centres. They're just going to offer blood pressure tests, and if it comes out high, they're going to send you off to your GP. So that's not a health service intervention, so that would fall under the public health remit. So I think we would consider that as in remit, if that's what you wanted to evaluate. But the nature of all these screening things is we need to see some third-party endorsement. I think specifically from the National Screening Committee that this is actually something that they would welcome. Because screening programs all cause harm. And some of them will give you some benefit. It's a question of identifying which ones. We would see that. I think we'd see the National Screening Committee as the main consumer of that output, and that they would have to issue advice as to yes or no. That's the example I thought of. The person who asked that might have a more concrete or a different example, in which case do get in contact with the office. But I wouldn't rule it out as automatically.
And I think it's fair to say that we try to not let anything fall through the gaps between the programmes, and we are all open to the concept of joint funding as well, if that was necessary.
It's not uncommon that we'll get a proposal in and we think, well, actually this is a health services intervention, and the health technology assessment programme will then pick it up. Because we're running out of the same office, it's very easy for us to shuffle things to the place where they're going to get the better hearing.
Can I ask the question?
Yes, of course.
You've talked about qualitative components of studies, but I wonder whether you can give any examples of studies that you've funded that have been wholly qualitative in their methodology.
I'd have to go to the website. We have funded some. I would have to go to the website to look up. It's not common, but it is definitely, I'm sure it's happened.
I'm sure it's happened as well. I can't tell you them off the top of my head. Community engagement rings a slight bell, but as Andrew said, I think it's not common, but I think we have on occasion.
The traveller health.
Could be.
So we think there's something under either community engagement or traveller health.
Right.
But again, if you have a qualitative study that falls in the remit, we would very happily consider it.
Yes, I suppose what I was interested in is whether evaluation of intervention is defined purely within a sort of trial quantitative methodology of evaluation, or whether evaluation and there are lots of approaches to evaluation that do take a wholly qualitative approach, and whether they would be seen as within remit of the programme.
Yes, yeah. So if it's a design that will answer a health-related question in the general area of non-health services, health interventions, then yes, we consider it. It's easier to come up with things like realist synthesis and other realist-based projects we've done, rather than sort of, you may or may not view that as qualitative. If you think realist is qualitative, then we've done quite a bit of that.
Yeah.
If it's more sort of interviews and focus groups, we've definitely done some. But I can't think of the exact thing offhand. But
I was thinking more of sort of ethnographic studies as part of a process evaluation.
I'm not sure ethnography, in that is ethnography likely to answer an intervention type question. There's far more likely to be a project around people in different geographical areas who experience different, say, local authority services, and then have been interviewed or otherwise assessed as to their impressions and experiences.
I think I'll just give a fine answer to this question. I perceive the qualitative fraternity to be a very mixed fraternity, just like the health economists are mixed, and just like the statisticians are mixed. And we would consider qualitative evaluation in context. Does it answer the questions that it sets out to answer? And would it have an impact? Would it change something? Would the answers change practice? I think that has to be part of it.
Thank you. There was a question also about assessing interventions that are already happening. Could you say a little bit more about which ones you've funded before, or just in general terms?
Well, if you go back to the streetlights, the local authority, 8 years ago, local authorities had started turning off streetlights in various ways. Some between midnight and 6, some at different times, some on different days of the week, some turning off all the lights, some turning off some of the lights. So these were things that were already going on. And so there's a prime example. So our team went along to local authorities who were doing this anyway, and got their before and after data, and then could control the local authorities who weren't doing this. So we like it, and often in today's environment, that's the way you have to do things. So some authorities are doing things, some authorities aren't. You can compare them, but to get the ones that aren't doing something to start doing it in a randomised way is almost impossible.
I would add a footnote to that in that, with the contributions, the huge contributions of people like Sue, Nicky and UCL, we're looking for the intervention to be adequately described. If it was in the behaviour change field, there's now a huge taxonomy and toolkit to use to describe an intervention properly. In the same way, in complex public health interventions, the panel is looking for the intervention to be well delineated and described. Now, a couple of years ago, we had the tidier checklist in the BNJ, and I know that there's a group funded in Scotland to produce a coding framework for complex public health interventions, which they say will go by the acronym the untidier checklist. And you can talk to Dr. Peter Craig in the MRC unit, who's corralled a group of experts to come up with that checklist. So we are looking for things that are well described, so that we know that this local authority is doing something slightly different actually from this local authority.
I think there's also an issue to do with generalisability with some of these, because there's not necessarily a lot of replication, and that it's maybe only one particular area or one control area sometimes that we're faced with in the board, and we're never quite sure whether A, it would generalise, and B, whether there's enough replication to be able to know that the results are sound. So I think people, perhaps when they put in applications, might want to think of trying to build in more replication, more areas, and in even in the cluster randomised trials, to make sure they have sufficient clusters. I think that's quite a common theme that comes through for the statisticians on the board.
Does the programme stipulate a time frame from when you expect the benefits of the research to be felt? Certainly other NIHR schemes do that.
No. It's useful to get a steer in the application as to how long do you think it will be before this will feed through, and there's a bit on the form about pathways to impact and things like that. But yeah, unlike say RFPB, we don't have a hard. We must expect to see this having impact within 3 years, or what the other schemes do. Yeah. If we look at it and we say, well, that's interesting, but we can't see that happening within 2 decades, then it's probably not going to be near the top of the funding list. Yeah. So we're looking for something timely, but there's no hard deadline.
It's just worth flagging up about natural experiments, because sometimes you think the outcome is going to be, well, in my instance, we thought it was going to be 2 years, but it's turned out to be 4 years, and it's not because of anything we've done, it's just because the intervention that was an environmental change took a lot longer to be done than we anticipated. But the good thing is just to keep in touch, and you are flexible with that and understanding with that. So the HR programme acknowledged that in certain instances you need to be flexible on timelines.
And we had a proposal to look at the new alcohol minimum unit pricing, which got delayed for various reasons, and so that's been sitting on the back burner. If we'd insisted on a delivery within so much time at the end of the project, that would never have worked.
It's now started.
It has now started, so
5 years later. I didn't know if it was worth mentioning about, which I know is a slightly different issue, but long-term outcomes and sustainability of behaviour change that we're interested in. I don't think any of us have touched on that. You'd be able to expand more.
Well, there are theoretical dimensions to that question, because not enough studies have looked at the determinants of maintenance of behaviour change, and we would typically, and this is not a hard and fast rule, look for at least 12 months follow-up after the intervention finished. That's not long enough in my view. Of course it's not, because people fall off the wagon and we change our behaviours. But typically we would look for about 12 months follow-up after an intervention finished. But there's a huge gap there in the literature about understanding behaviour change methods, if it's a behaviour change intervention we're talking about.
You also mentioned breakpoints and go, no-go criteria for maybe some more riskier projects. Would you expect those parts to be costed separately?
So in the outline proposal, the first stage, no. If you're sort of proposing then a full trial, but with the stopping rules with assessment of various points, it sort of, I think it falls out of the costing, doesn't it? So you can see, we plan to evaluate this and this 18 months into the project. By the time you're filling in the full proposal, you'll be sick of all the accountancy tables you have to fill in. But I think if we need to know the cost of that bit, it's comparatively easy to look at the first 2 columns on the table and say, well, so that phase is going to cost about this much. There is a bit on the form about please justify the amount of money you're asking for. So it would do no harm to say it will cost us £500,000 up until this break point, and then there will be another 1,500 up for another £500,000 afterwards. But the board will generally look at the headline figure. And if they really want to know how much that first bit costs, then they will then they can look at it from the table. But fundamentally, it's what's the cost of the whole project, because they're going to hope that you're going to get through that first stage.
Okay, great, thank you. Any more questions? No? Okay, well, I think we're drawing to a close. There was just one other question about funding of policy research. And is that covered by the programme, or is that more under the PRP programme?
Do you have a definition of policy research?
No, it's just a very broad question, unfortunately.
Okay, so PRP addresses things that the people in the department want to know the answer to. Okay. Now, if you're talking, can we evaluate policies? Well, if you have a, so minimum unit pricing in Scotland, for example, is the evaluation of a policy of the Scottish Government, and we funded it. So it's not ruled out. That there might need to be a justification as to why this was the appropriate programme to go to, and often if we get something like that, we will have a conversation with the policy research programme, because it's not uncommon that they're doing it anyway, and so you might get turned down because PRP are funding almost are going to commission almost the exact same project. So it can be worth talking to PRP first before you spend all your time investing in a policy research proposal, just in case they're going to be doing it anyway.
Okay. I think if there are no more questions, then I'll call the session to a close and thank all the contributors to today. As you've heard throughout the presentations, the programme team and RDS will be very pleased to hear from you. You'll find the web links in the presentations, so do get in touch, pick up the phone, access us through the websites. I hope you found this morning useful. If you've got further questions, then please do send them in. We'll be writing them up as a Q&A. So I'd now like to bring the session to a close, and thank you for attending or logging in. Thank you very much.